most of us come from Protestant backgrounds, and one thing Protestants have always emphasized is that God is not confined to any one space or even to certain spaces. God's presence is everywhere. You don't have to go anywhere special to be in the presence of God. You don't have to go to a church or a cathedral or anything. God is with you just as much in your backyard as He is in any church or cathedral. And so for most of us, the notion of sacred places or sacred spaces is a foreign notion. We don't really see certain spaces or certain places as being sacred. In fact, we probably haven't thought much about that because of the Protestant belief that God is everywhere, that you can feel God's presence wherever you are. And I believe that's true. You don't have to go to somewhere special to feel God's presence. But even having said that, I find the notion of sacred spaces and sacred places to be fascinating because there are a lot of those mentioned in the Bible, especially in the Old Testament. And that's what I'd like to talk about today, the notion of sacred places. Now, if you look at these in the Old Testament, it's interesting that you can separate them out into several different categories. And that's the way I'd like for us to talk about them today, in their categories. And the first category is places that were seen as sacred in the Old Testament because of what happened at that place, what God did at that place. One of the best known ones comes from the book of Joshua, in chapters 3 and 4. You remember the Hebrews had been wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. And in the book of Joshua, they're finally ready to enter the promised land. And here they're standing there at the Jordan River. And it was flood season, and the river was real wide and up and fast. And they're trying to get across the river. Across the river is the promised land. They don't have any way to get across there. And so the priests take the Ark of the Covenant, and they carry it out there, and they stand with it in the water. The water holds back, and the Hebrews are able to cross over into the promised land on dry land. And then when they get to the other side, Joshua tells one man from each tribe to go find a large stone. And they pile those stones up there on the side of the river. And Joshua says this is a sign among you. When your children ask their fathers in the time to come, what do these stones mean? Then you shall answer them that the waters of the Jordan were cut off before the Ark of the Covenant when it passed over. And so that space, that place, became sacred to him, because that's when the power of God parted the water and allowed them to cross over into the promised land. It was a place that was sacred and special because it was a place where the power of God was manifested. It was the power of God that parted the waters, and they put those rocks there so they would remember that was a special, a sacred place where God had parted the waters and allowed them to go into the promised land. But by doing that, though, there's nothing that says that that was the only place where God ever did anything. The Bible's full of other places where God did things. That's not the only place where God could do something. It's not that that's the place you have to go if you want God to do something for you. It's simply that at this place, at a point in the past, God did something. He intervened in the world. And that place is remembered and becomes sacred and special because of that. So that's the first category of sacred places. The places where God has done something for people, and people remember it. The second category of sacred places is a little different. These places are not necessarily places where God did anything, but they are places where God appeared to or spoke to people. And those spaces are considered sacred in the same way. In Genesis chapter 6, Isaac sends his son Jacob to find a wife. And Jacob sets out to find a wife. It gets to be night. He stops to go to sleep. He gets a rock and he uses it as a pillow. He lays down and goes to sleep. And he has a dream. He dreams of a ladder. It's reaching from heaven to earth. You may have heard that. Jacob's ladder. And there are angels going up and down that ladder, going up and down from heaven to earth. And God is standing on the top of that ladder. And God speaks. And God says, Jacob, you and your descendants will have land, and I'll be with you wherever you go. I'll never leave you. Jacob wakes up and he says, surely the Lord is in this place. How awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. And he calls that place Bethel, and it becomes a sacred place. Another example we heard as our Old Testament reading. We heard God appear to Moses from the burning bush. And if you remember, the first thing that God said to Moses from that bush was, take off your shoes, for the place where you stand is holy ground. See, God appeared there, and that made that place special. Another example is found in the book of Judges, and this is the account of a man named Gideon. Now, the Hebrews had displeased God, and God punished them by allowing the Midianites to rule over them for 7 years. At the end of that time, God decided they had been punished enough, and he called a man named Gideon to deliver the Hebrews from the Midianites. Gideon was supposed to raise an army and go fight the Midianites. The way this happened was that Gideon was out threshing wheat one day, and an angel of the Lord was sitting underneath the terebinth tree. Now, unknown to Gideon, this was not really an angel. This was God himself. But the angel speaks to Gideon and says, you are to go out and raise an army and defeat the Midianites. And Gideon says, now wait a minute, I can't do that. I'm not able to do that. And the angel says, well, I'll be with you. And Gideon then asks for a sign. He says, I want a sign. And then he told the angel, he said, don't you leave here. I'm going to go get some things to make a sacrifice with, and I'll bring it back. You wait till I come back. So Gideon went and he got a young goat, and he got unleavened bread, and he brought it back to offer a sacrifice. The angel was still there, and the angel tells Gideon, okay, put all this stuff on this rock over here. And Gideon does it. The angel raises his staff, and immediately fire comes and just immediately consumes it all. And Gideon realizes now that this was not just an angel, this was God. But in a flash, the angel is gone. And Gideon says, oh no, I've seen God face to face. And their belief was that anybody that saw God face to face would die. And he thought, okay, I'm going to die. But God appears to him and tells him that he will not die. And so then it says that Gideon builds an altar to God there. And the book of Judges says that altar is still there to this very day. Of course, we're talking about this very day when the book of Judges was written. Because that was a sacred place. It was where God had appeared to Gideon. Now, all the places that we talked about in this category are where God actually appeared to people, and the places are sacred. There's something special about those places simply because God appeared there. Another example is Mount Sinai. In the book of Exodus, after the Hebrews leave Egypt, remember, they're in the desert. God speaks to Moses on Mount Sinai. God speaks to Moses there several times and gives Moses the 10 Commandments there. It's the place where God had spoken to Moses But only Moses. Others were not allowed to go. And for a while, the Hebrew people actually thought that that's where God was, up there on Mount Sinai. It's not that that's just where God went and talked to God or prayed to God, but God was actually up there on that mountain. Exodus 19 says, Mount Sinai was altogether in a smoke because the Lord descended upon it in fire. The smoke ascended as the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mount quaked greatly. The voice of the trumpet sounded long and waxed louder and louder. So God was actually there, and that was a sacred space. But it's interesting that these places do not apparently become shrines where people go back. Sure, in the book of Joshua it says, that when your children ask you why those stones are there, you're to tell them. But there's no indication that people made pilgrimages to those places. No indication they flocked back there over and over to see if they too could have an encounter with God. The people heard from God from Mount Sinai when they were in the wilderness, but there's nothing in the latter parts of the Old Testament that says that they kept going back there to hear from God. It was just something that happened at that particular time, and then it was over. Now, another category of sacred spaces would be a temple or a church building. Now, it was late in the history of the Hebrew people before they ever had a temple. For most of their history, their sacrifices were made in a tent that was called a tabernacle. And this tabernacle was at one time seen as the place where God actually lived. God's presence was actually in there. That's where God was located, was in that tent. Now later, in the later Hebrew period, King Solomon built the temple, which was a real building, and that was seen as a sacred space. And just like with the tabernacle, it was thought that that's where God was located. God was located inside that temple. But when you really look at the Old Testament as a whole, you see that overall the temple doesn't play that big of a role. It does for a while. But when compared to the broad sweep of the Old Testament, everything that concerns the temple is a relatively minor part. And so when you think about it, the idea of a temple as a sacred space doesn't play a major role in the broad sweep of the Old Testament. Besides, you couldn't go in there anyway. The temple was a very small building, relatively so. It was, if you take the dimensions given in the Bible, in the temple that is described in the Old Testament is very similar in size to the new Episcopal Church over there on Sumter Street. That's about the same size that building was. And you couldn't go in there. Only certain priests could go in there. And in some parts of the building, only one could go in there one time a year. Sometimes we get the idea that the Jews back then went to the Jerusalem temple like we go to church. That's not the way it worked. You could not go in. When the New Testament speaks of people going up to the temple to pray, they're outside. They're outside on the porch or in the yard. They don't go in. So now I want us to talk about the final category of sacred spaces. And these are the places that will become sacred in the future. Now earlier we talked about Jacob. He was out trying to find a wife and lay down one night to go to sleep with his head on a rock. He had a vision of a ladder with angels going back up and down into heaven, God at the top. And he said this is a holy place here because this happened. At the time that happened, the experience of Moses with the burning bush had not yet happened. The experience of the Hebrews crossing over into the promised land had not yet happened. The experience of Gideon had not yet happened. Those were sacred spaces that would become sacred in the future, but in the time of Jacob they were not yet. And so the final category to think about are those spaces where in the future they will become sacred. where God will either intervene and do something, or where God's presence will be known and God will speak there. We have no way of knowing where those future sacred spaces will be. They will become sacred in the future. And so I think that that is really the value of thinking about sacred spaces. For they tell us to look for the continuing experience of God in our lives. For the continuing times when God intervenes in our lives. For the continuing times when God speaks to us in some way. It's not just that these things have happened in the past. It's that we look at them as happening continuously. The interactions of God with people are ongoing. It's not that just God did intervene in the past. It's that God will continue to do so in the future. Sacred spaces tell us that in the past, people have had experiences with God intervening. People have had experiences with God speaking to them. And they tell us that in the future, people will continue to do that. That God will continue to intervene. God will continue to speak to people. Sacred places tell us that God is active in the world. God is not sitting off in heaven somewhere with his back turned to us. God is active in the world here right now, doing things. And we take as sacred those places where we see the activity and the presence of God. There's one really important thing to notice, and I don't know if y'all noticed it when we were talking about all of these sacred spaces. With the exception of the temple, which we actually saw does not play that big of a role in the Old Testament, none of those sacred spaces were inside. They're all outside. They're all out in nature. They're not structures built by human beings. And I think that's something that we don't stop to think about enough. When the times that we think about God and how God acts, it's not confined inside a building. When God did something for people, when God intervened in people's lives and spoke to people, most often it's outside in nature. And I don't want to skip over the importance of that. Think about in the New Testament. Where were the shepherds when the birth of Jesus was announced to them? They were outside. How did the wise men know how to find the baby Jesus? They went outside and looked up and saw a star. Where did John the Baptist preach? Out in the wilderness. Where did he baptize? In the Jordan River. Where did Jesus go after he was baptized? He went into the wilderness for 40 days. Where did the transfiguration take place? It took place on the mountain, outside. Where do the Gospels tell us that Jesus went to pray? They tell us he went outside to a lonely place. Where did Jesus go to pray before his crucifixion? He went to the Garden of Gethsemane. Where did Jesus appear to the Apostle Paul? Outside on the road to Damascus. Now granted, it's not only outside that people had encounters with God, but the overwhelming majority of the ones that happen in the Bible are outside. You see, there is a sense from these things that there is a connection between God's power and the natural world. There is a connection between us having an experience of God in our lives and being in the natural world. In the Bible, we see the natural world as sacred space. Way often, more often than not, it is outside, not inside, that people have these encounters with God and that God does something. think that's something that we don't think very much about today. Christianity, to many people, is something that happens inside a church building where you're completely isolated from the rest of the world. You know, most places, most churches have either stained glass or opaque glass like we've got here. I remember when we first moved into the new building over there at Redeemer, the stained glass windows were about a year behind schedule, so we moved in there for about a year before the windows were done. And those humongous windows in there were just clear. You could see out and see inside the trees. It was so weird to sit there in church and be able to see out from those humongous windows, you know. Then when they put the stained glass windows in, you couldn't see out anymore. And some of these new churches that's being built that's like auditorium type churches, they don't have windows in them at all. No windows. All those new auditorium churches, you know, they don't have windows in them. But the Bible is full of people having experiences of God outside in the natural world. Whether it's an experience of God doing something like parting the waters of the Jordan River, or whether it's God appearing in a burning bush and telling Moses to lead the children of Israel out of Egypt, or whether God is sitting under a tree talking to Gideon and telling him to go defeat the Midianites. The Bible is full of people's experiences of God outside in nature. And if you read the Bible, you'll figure out that the Bible is not a book that's a list of doctrine and beliefs. The Bible is a book that is full of people's experiences of God in their own lives. That's really what the Bible is. People telling us of their experiences of God. And by far the great majority of those experiences come outside in the natural world. So I guess you could say that if you want to have an experience of God, go outside. And maybe you too will experience a sacred